So the question we've been asking for the last 3 weeks is simply this: what's essential, right? What's essential to following Jesus? You know, because there's lots of things that people have ideas about. I told you, last week that I made this list up. There isn't like any official list from anybody. It was just like, when I get down, what are the core things that Jesus talked about that were essential to follow him? And the good news is, knowing what's essential helps us know what's not. Because sometimes it's easy to be in environments like this and listen to people like me who make everything of equal importance. And it's like, how can everything be of equal importance? Because when it is, really nothing is. So let's pick up a story that Matthew, one of Jesus' closest followers, one of the 12, was there for. In fact, Matthew writes a number of the ones we're going to look at today. He's the recording person for these pieces. Here's what he describes one day. He says, this guy comes to Jesus, and he asks him a really heartfelt question. The guy was serious. And he looks at Jesus and says, "Teacher, what good thing, what good deed must I do to have forever? What have eternal life, right? What's the thing I have to do?" This guy recognizes that there's something missing in his life. And Jesus looks at him and I think smiles and says, well, if you want to have life forever, you want to enter into life, obey, that is, keep the commandments, period. And some of you have heard this, your whole life about keeping the commandments. And that's how Jesus responds to the guy who says, what is it? What do I have to do to get that eternal life? To which the guy stops and asks Jesus an important question that for us doesn't seem that important, because we think, how can it be, that big a deal? He asked him, which commandments? Now, most of us, when we read this, we think, well, there's 10 of them. He's asking, which one of those is the important one, right? But the reality is, in his context, in Judaism, there were 613 commandments, which is like a lot of them, right? In fact, the majority of them were negatives. They were the thou shalt not kind of ones. And there was, a less number of thou shalt kind of pieces. So 613. And when Jesus says, keep the commandments, he's like, phew, that's a lot. I have a hard time, some of us have a hard time remembering the 10, let alone 613. So it's like, which ones, right? To which Jesus replies something very interesting. He says, these ones, you must not murder anyone. You must not be guilty of adultery, right? And so if you're familiar with the 10 Commandments, you're thinking, these are from the 10 Commandments. He goes on and says, you must not steal, and you must not tell lies about your neighbor, testify falsely. You must honor your father and your mother, to which all the fathers and mothers said. That's right, son, daughter, right? And love your neighbor as you love yourself, which if you're familiar with the Bible, you're like, time out, Jesus, that's not one of the big 10, right? That's like a next one. That's like something Jesus said, but it was one of the 613 commands for a Jewish person. So Jesus throws a little bit of curveball, and sometimes we don't pick it up because we think, Jesus is reciting a few of the 10 commandments to say he's talking about all the 10 commandments, and Jesus throws this extra one in there. And the guy listens to Jesus and thinks, okay, he's talking about the 10 commandments and this idea of loving, my neighbor, and he responds to Jesus this way. He says, Jesus, done deal. I've done that. I have obeyed. I've kept these things carefully. I've been devout in this, Jesus. I'm a serious, follower of God. I've been all in, and I've kept those things carefully. But he knows that there's still something missing. That's why he came to Jesus in the first place, because he knows his rule keeping hasn't been enough to give him a sense of peace. So he asked Jesus again, what else? What else do I need to do? What do I still lack, Jesus? Because clearly something's missing, because I just don't feel like I got it. So Jesus looks at him, I think maybe nods his head and smiles and said, well, if you want to be perfect, you want to be complete, if you want to, kind of cover the whole basis, here's what you need to do. You need to go and sell your possessions. Which this is one of those moments we talked about last week about how the Bible's foundational to our faith, right? And about the ways we read the Bible. This is one of those ones I've never known anybody say this is a specific rule for everybody, right? We're all very clear this is a very unique situation this is talking about, right? But go and sell all your possessions, and not just sell them, but you give the money to the poor. So it's not like you sell them and you keep the money, you give it all away, and then you're gonna have treasure in heaven. Then after that, come and follow me. That's Jesus' invitation. After you take care of business, the things that you're asking about, how do I get this? Do all those things, then come follow me. Now, if you're familiar with the story, you know that it takes a sad turn at this moment, because the young guy, when he hears this, he's heartbroken. In fact, Matthew remembers he leaves sorrowfully. He's downtrodden, his head's down. He's just crushed because Matthew says he was rich. And Matthew would know what rich was like because Matthew had been rich because he'd been a tax collector. This guy had way many possessions. And he walks away. And then Jesus goes in this big explanation. The disciples are thrown off by this idea because they've always viewed as having a lot of stuff, being blessed by God. And Jesus saying, no, that's not necessarily a blessing by God. You got to just get rid of it all. For this guy, he's got to get rid of it all and go away. And I think this reminds us of something that's really important when we think about following Jesus. And it's simply this, that sometimes following is hard. Sometimes it requires us to make some hard decisions, not just tough decisions, but some really hard decisions. To choose some things that we wouldn't necessarily do on our own, but in order to follow Jesus, we have to step in that place. Which is good to know because there are some hard moments, some hard decisions we all have to make in whoever we're following, whatever we're doing. But I'll remind you again that knowing what's essential helps us know what's not, which is really helpful in some key moments. In fact, Matthew will remember it's just probably a few weeks or maybe a few months later, there's another situation where Jesus asked another question about, these commandments, these laws. The setting of this is that there's this Pharisee who Matthew recognizes was an expert on the law of Moses. So this wasn't just your regular devout religious person. This guy was an expert. He was considered by everybody an expert in Moses' law. He knew his law inside. He knew the 613. He knew all the sub-laws that they had talked about that we call the oral tradition, the oral Torah, that were covering, more points about those pieces. And this expert in law comes to Jesus to ask him a question. And we discover that it's a trick question. It's designed to try to trip Jesus up, to trap him in an answer. And here's the question he asked Jesus. Teacher, which command in the law is the most important, is the greatest? Which we think, well, how can he ask that question? I mean, there's again, we think 10 commandments. How can he ask which one of the 10 is the most important? Because aren't they all important? But that's not what he's asking. He's asking which of the 612 is the most important. Because again, they have a whole lot more than just the 10. And the question really is, are they all equally important? Or are some more important than others? Which makes some of us who are consider ourselves really religious a little uncomfortable because how can somebody say one is more important than the other? But here's the thing I don't want you to miss. Jesus doesn't question the question. He isn't like, that's a terrible question. What kind of dumb question? How can you ask which one's the most important? I mean, we got 10. Let's just look at the 10. Or, out of the 612, these other ones. Jesus actually validates the question in the way he answers. And sometimes we rush to the end of it and we forget that why Jesus answered the question is giving us some really important information. Because here's how Jesus answers that question from this guy who's an expert in the law. Which one is the most important? Which one is the one that everything hangs on? What's the foundational commandment? And Jesus says, all right, here it is. Doesn't even think. He just says, listen, here's the commandment. The most important commandment is to love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, to be all in with God. That's the most important commandment. And really, it's more an invitation than it is a command, because how can you command somebody to love? It's an invitation. The most important commandment is actually an invitation that says, love God with everything you have. In fact, Jesus clarifies, says, this is the first and most important, the greatest commandment. And when he says first here, he doesn't mean first like we think of, number one, which was the answer to the guy's question. The Greek word he uses here means first in sequence, which they're thinking, his crowd, when he hears this use of the word first, they're like, first in sequence? It's a pretty simple question, Jesus. The question was, which one, right? Which one of all the 612, which one is the most important? Now Jesus says, well, the first in sequence is this one, right? Love God with everything. And the second one, second in sequence, command is like the first. It's as important as the first. And here it is, love your neighbor as you love yourself. To which I think the crowd, when they hear this, go, what? I mean, that's one of the laws, but it's not like, it's not even make the top 10, right? Neither of the two make the top 10. How are these the most important, Jesus? Then Jesus drops a bombshell that the crowd would have gasped at when they heard Jesus say this. We just hear it and go, okay, but for them, this was a huge statement. Jesus says, all the law and all the writings of the prophets. Let me ask you a deeply theological question. How many is all? Not hard, right? I'm not trying to trick you. I normally don't try to trick, right? I mean, all is all, right? So he's saying, this is earth-shattering to them because they're thinking, wait, we got all these, the whole Torah, all the law refers to the first 5, what we call the books of the Bible, right? The 5 different categories that are in the Bible. And all the writings of the prophets is basically all the other stuff. All of those things that you've based your faith on depend on, hang on these 2 commands, which is a huge statement because Jesus is saying, if you want to know what's the most important, these are the most important of all the important stuff. All of them are not equal. These 2 are the most important. These 2 are the ones that all the rest rest on, which is helpful because it actually gives us a filter as we read all the rest of the laws and the rules. All the writings of the prophets, all the other parts of the thing we call the Bible are helpful to say, okay, when it talks about this, is that as important as these 2? And Jesus say, no, that's important, but it's not as important. These are the 2 important things. Because here's why they're so important. What if in not doing the second, we're not doing the first? Because I'm guessing some of you have been around places like I've been at times where there are people that are devout in their faith, right? It's clear that they know their Bible, but it's not always so clear that they know Jesus. They're clear on what the rules are, but they're not always clear about what the purpose of the rules are. And what if that's true? What if doing the second, this idea of loving our neighbor, if we're not doing that, we're not really doing the first of loving God with everything? Because what if our love for God is demonstrated and validated by our love for others? Because Jesus is saying they're both equally important, and you can't say we're just going to do the one and not do the other. What if our love really is demonstrated and validated by our love for others, not our rule keeping? Because again, some of you have come from backgrounds where rules were like a huge, huge thing, right? Come from church situations where it was all about the rules, all about what you can and can't do. Normally it was more, what you can't do than you can do. But Jesus says that's not the important thing. The important thing is that we're all in with God, and being all in God means we're caring for those around us. So Mark will share a story that Matthew doesn't include in his memories of what Jesus did. But this comes from Peter, so Peter was there, and Mark's getting it secondhand. Peter remembers that one Sabbath day, Jesus and his guys are walking through some fields of grain. There's these big fields of grain. They're just making their own path through there. As they're walking through, Jesus' followers, as they're making this path, they begin to pick some of the heads of grain, right? It's become ripe. They'll grab it off the top. They're crushing it up in the hands, and they're eating something because they're hungry. They're on this journey. They're actually going to a synagogue. So they're on their way to church, we would call it today, on this Sabbath day. And then Peter remembers that these Pharisees pop up. And if you've read Peter's version, I love it because it seems like the Pharisees are always just, looking over, hiding behind things, popping up on Jesus, sort of surprising him, like, we're watching you. And they're out in this field of grain, right? They're just him and the guys, and all of a sudden these Pharisees pop up out of nowhere. And here's what the Pharisees do. They pop up and they say to Jesus, why? Why are your followers doing what is not lawful on the Sabbath day? Why are they breaking the rules? Because the reality is you're not supposed to work on the Sabbath. That's the 4th commandment. And then they also had 39 categories of prohibited work for on the Sabbath. It wasn't just 39 more rules. It was 39 categories that had multiple other laws behind it. So they had to define what work was, because if we just say don't work, well, somebody can say I'm not working, I'm just enjoying myself, and I'm just doodling, I'm doing something. No, we have to define what work is. And so they looked at Jesus' followers and they said, hey, your guys are breaking a bunch of the rules, right? They're working because they're actually, we have a category for that. They're harvesting. Not supposed to do that. That's work. They're willowing, which is, getting the seeds out of it. That's work. And the fact that they're walking through somebody else's property and just knocking down all their fields, while that was actually okay, just doesn't seem right? And again, it reminds me of how some of us have come from situations where everything was about the rules, right? Some of you, came from places that, kept the Sabbath. And in keeping the Sabbath, it was more about the things that you weren't supposed to do than it was the things that you were supposed to do, right? In fact, as you remember back there, it was all about the don'ts, right? We don't do that. No, we don't do that. In fact, it almost seemed like the more things you couldn't do, the more it made the Sabbath a joy, I guess. But you also remember this, that there seemed to be more don'ts than do's, right? It's like, I remember hearing some kids say, what can we do, right? Because it's like the list of can'ts is just like, multiple pages long. Just, what can we do, right? Well, you can sit in your room and listen to some music, but only good music. You can read some books, but only good books. And you can maybe play with some toys, but not, only in certain ways, right? Which we wonder sometimes why our kids don't enjoy Sabbath, right? So these guys come to Jesus and they think they got him, right? Why are you guys doing what's unlawful? And Jesus doesn't even validate their argument, because Jesus says, where you're getting this unlawfulness is not, from the thing we call the Bible. This is actually extra stuff that you guys have made up, that you put on, trying to be, devout to God, showing your love for God, that you've been, all about honoring God and respecting God and keeping God safe, that you've put all this on people. And Jesus doesn't even validate them. He doesn't argue about it being lawful. He just says, hey guys, by the way, you're Pharisees, devout people, you know your Bible. You ever hear about David? Read what David did? I think it goes on this explanation. You go home and read it. That's basically, David, the king, he's on run from the actual king, right? He's been appointed king, but he's not king yet. And he's on a run trying to stay away from the Saul, who is the king. And David is out in the middle of nowhere. There's a little temple there. He goes to the priest and tells the priest, hey, I'm hungry. I know you have bread in there because part of their daily sacrifices had bread in it. I'm hungry. So David takes the bread that's only supposed to be for the priest, and then he also gives it to his army, his military guys, which is really forbidden. Jesus doesn't argue the legality of any of this stuff. He just says, hey, what do you do with David? Because it's really hard to explain what do you do with David. But Jesus drops that up, and then he says to the Pharisees, he looks in the eye and says simply this, and it's an incredible statement if we get it. He says, the Sabbath day was made to benefit people. The Sabbath was made for man. They, talking about people, were not made for the Sabbath. It was not man made for the Sabbath day. And the sad thing is that when we get this reversed, people never benefit. It makes just for a worse and worse experience when we make it all about the Sabbath and all about its rules and the regulations and all the extra stuff that we've thrown on, just like they did, thousands of years ago. I've told you this before, and I want to remind you again that God didn't create people so they would be someone to keep his laws. It wasn't like God was sitting up in heaven one day and was like, man, I got this great set of laws I thought of, right? Got this big 10. We got another, 603 that we'll add later. But it's like really great laws. I just can't wait to have somebody to keep them. So you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to make people. It doesn't work that way, right? Nobody comes up with rules to manage. First of all, you come up with people, then you figure out, okay, now what are some things I can give them that'll help them in life? But the reality is, rule keeping is the gravitational pull of most faith traditions. And whatever faith tradition you may come from, whatever faith tradition you may be even part of right now, you think about it, right? Islam, it's about, keeping the rules, right? Doing the things. Yeah, as long as in my life I go do this rule and I do that rule and I do this. That's how I know I'm a good follower of God. Judaism, honoring God, keeping the commandments, keeping the rules. Hinduism, Buddhism, there may not be a set of rules as much as it is about, just trying to get better every lifetime until we're so good that we cease to exist, which seems, at least to me, sort of a weird way of doing it, right? But it is about rule keeping. It's about, there's some rules that you got to keep preventing, otherwise you come back as, a snail or something like that. And I'm not making fun of that. That's just their belief system, right? That there is this rule piece. And the problem with rule keeping is it becomes about rules more than it comes about the ideas behind the rules. And what if people really are God's priority, not the rules? And when Jesus says, the The Sabbath was made for people. Here's the reality. That doesn't mean that the rules are unimportant. It's just that they aren't the most important. And here's the thing I think that Jesus would encourage us to think about, because if he kind of picked the Sabbath because that's what he got called out on and said, oh, by the way, it was made for the benefit of people, right? It's made for people, not people for it. What if each of the 10 commandments were made for us? Would that change how we think about them and what they say? I mean, what if they really are about benefiting the quality of our lives and the lives of the people around us? Let me think about it. We're just going to go through the Big Ten real quickly, right? Think about it. Life goes better when we don't have competing interests, right? No other gods before me is the first commandment. But some of you know this on a daily basis, right? Maybe you have a family at home, maybe you got little kids, and every time you go off to work, they say mommy or daddy, oh, please don't go. They cry, and you're like, oh, I wish I could be there, right? You go off to work, and you like what you do, and you're like good at it, and like, I love being at work, but I'd love to be home. And the reality is you're going to cheat one of those two things. And that's a question we all have to answer. Which one of the two am I going to cheat? Because you can't compete with two competing interests. Somebody will always end up losing out. So it makes sense when God says, hey, don't have any other gods before me, because all these competing interests aren't going to make your life better. They're just going to make it more complicated, and you're going to feel terrible through the process. And secondly, life goes better when we don't shrink God down or box him up. Right? It's the idea of no images, but we make images in lots of different ways. They can be physical, they can be mental, they can be beliefs. Life goes better when, number three, when our beliefs and values and behavior match, when there's consistency in our lives. And the reality is it's better for us and it's better for others too, right? When they see that, what we value, what we believe actually matches how we live it out. And life goes better when we make space to rest and reconnect and re-engage. We end up winning, right? Because who doesn't need a break? A regular pattern of break in life to get away from producing, providing, and just being able to sit back and relax. Some of us, that's really hard because we say, if I'm relaxing, I'm getting behind, and I can't get behind because I got to stay ahead. We've trapped ourselves in a cycle. And the only way to break that cycle is to break that cycle. Life goes better, when we respect the people who gave us life, and it actually does something for us and in us. And I know I've talked to some of you, and I've heard some of your stories about how you're stepping up to help or take care of your parents in their situation they find themselves in. And I know personally that's hard and that's tough, but it is the right thing to do. And there's something about being able to live with yourself when you know you're doing the right thing, even though it's taking away your chance for rest and relaxation on some of the time. But that does something to us when we honor and respect those who gave us life. And life goes better when we don't kill others, whether it's literally, figuratively, or professionally. I mean, the reality is it's better for all of us, right? If you're not after me and I'm not after you, that's a good place to live. And life goes better when we don't mess around, when we don't take what's not ours, when we don't lie, stretch, or withhold the truth. It's better for everybody, right? And life goes better when we don't keep wishing we had what we don't have, or believe that because we can't be happy. Life is better when we're good and thankful for what we've got. And the reality is, if the rules aren't benefiting us, maybe we're misunderstanding them. Because Jesus said, listen, the Sabbath was made for man, but what again if all of them were made for us, right? What if they're for our benefit? And when we don't see them as a benefit, maybe the issue isn't them as much as us, or how we've been taught to think about them, or how we think we feel about them. In fact, when people apply the law of God in a way that harms others, they aren't applying it correctly. And the reality of that statement is this, that when that happened, that ticked Jesus off. If you don't like tick, put whatever word you like in there, right? But it's like, it made Jesus highly upset. Is that better? In fact, one of the sections that Matthew remembers that happens, not that much after they had this big question about what's the most important commandment. Jesus has a section that's often referred to as the woes. And this isn't the woes as, this is, woe is me. But this is like, whoa, this is bad news for the religious leaders of his day. And Jesus goes off. You can go home and read it. He ticks off and he just goes after them. He is so ticked off at them because how they've used God's laws to harm people and to control people and to not benefit them. In fact, we're going to pick it up partway through this whole long list. He starts everyone by saying, just how terrible for you. Woe to you, teachers of the law, you scribes and you Pharisees. You're hypocrites, which may not fit your personal picture of who Jesus is, because Jesus is always loving and caring and gracious. But sometimes I think you can be loving and caring and gracious by telling somebody the truth. Sometimes you have to tell that truth in a way they'll hear it, which doesn't always sound so great to other people listening to it. But Jesus is like, you guys are a bunch of hypocrites, and let me tell you why. He says, you give to God 1/10, you tithe on everything you have. You are so meticulous, right, about every minutia. You have majored dramatically in the minor things. You tithe, you give 10% of even your mint, your dill, and your cumin. I mean, imagine the littlest seeds you can imagine and trying to get, you got 100 of them and you're trying to get 10 out of there, right? Oh, man. And they're just but they're careful because we're honoring God by doing this. He says, you're so careful about these things, but here's your problem. You don't obey, you ignore, you neglect the really important teachings, the weightier matters of the law. You're missing out on the really heavy stuff, the important stuff, which is justice. Justice is not getting justice for yourself, but being fair to people and making sure people are being treated fairly. Mercy, of not giving people what they deserve, but giving them a second or maybe a third or a fourth chance. And faithfulness. You missed those things in your commitment to all the details of keeping the law. You have missed the more important stuff, the heavier stuff, which is the heart stuff and how we treat others. And Jesus looks at those devout religious people and says, listen, these are the things you should do without neglecting those other things. You can do all the tithing you want, but don't miss the really important stuff. And here's a question. What if the danger of rule keeping is that it convinces us of something that isn't true? And the thing that convinces us that isn't true is that we're good with God because we keep the rules. And some of you are wired, right, as rule keepers. It's all about keep the rules. Maybe it's, your firstborn, maybe that's your problem. Maybe your middle child, maybe that's your problem. But you're like, I got to do it. And you know how this process works if you've been around it, right? Know the rules and do the rules and, right? You know what the rules are, you just do the rules. That's right. And keep at it. That's how we know we're good with God. And sometimes in places like this and people like me have told you that kind of idea. But the reality is we're good with God when we live them out with love and mercy and care. Because Jesus said, listen, you want to know what the most important commandment is? Actually, it's a two-parter, right? It's to love God, your God, with everything you have. Your heart, your mind, your soul, your strength. And to love your neighbor as you love yourself. The truth is, some of us love us a little less, right? And we give ourselves a lot of breaks and we, justify ourselves. We forgive ourselves. We go on with life because we love ourselves. And Jesus isn't saying don't love yourself. He's saying just need to be fair and consistent. Love others just like you love yourself. Be a little more compassionate towards them. Because here's the final thought. What if the point of the law isn't the keeping, but it's the benefiting? And when we think about it just about keeping, we miss not only the spirit or the attitude behind it, we also miss the benefit of it. That what's good for people is good for people. Something to think about today.